What is muralismo?
Muralismo, or Mexican muralism, is an art movement that developed in the 1920s. Muralismo was characterized by socially aware, nationalistic murals that glorified Mexican history and cultural traditions after a period of political upheaval following the overthrow of the Mexican dictator, General Porfirio Diaz. Three key figures of the movement were Diego Rivera, 1886 to 1957, José Clement Orozco, 1883 to 1949, and David Alfaro Siqueiros, 1896 to 1974. Murals were commissioned by the new government for public spaces such as schools, churches, and government buildings as a celebration of Mexican nationalism and with the idea that art should be accessible to all.
What is Cubism?
Cubism was a revolutionary development in modernist art that began in the early 20th century and lasted for decades. Cubism is characterized by fragmented images, or images that have been broken up and viewed from multiple angles. Cubism has its roots in the post-impressionist work of Paul Cézanne and primitivism. It is most closely associated with the work of Picasso and Georges Braque. 1882 to 1963, as well as Juan Gris, 1887 to 1927, and Fernand Léger, 1881 to 1955. Cubism can be considered an attempt to distill complex visual images into an aesthetically unified whole. Cubist artists are interested in capturing the essence of an object and placing it in visual context. The development of Cubism has been linked by some scholars to the massive cultural and social changes taking place during the turn of the century, including enormous changes in technology and industry. Cubism is divided into various phases, the earliest of which are analytic cubism and synthetic cubism. Analytic cubism was developed by Picasso and Braque in 1909. A good example of analytic cubism is Braque's Violin and Palette. 1909 to 1910, in which the image of a violin has been fragmented, as if the violin was made of shattered glass that has been swept up into a pile of crystal-like shards. Each shard of the violin is visually analyzed in the painting, allowing the viewer to contemplate the physical characteristics of the instrument in a new way. During the analytic cubist phase, Picasso and Braque painted objects that were almost, but not completely, dissolved into abstraction. By contrast, synthetic cubism is characterized by simple forms, less abstraction, and the use of collage, a process in which the artist applies elements, such as newspaper, to the canvas with glue. Examples of synthetic cubism include Picasso's still life with mandolin and guitar, 1924, and his collage piece, Glass and Bottle of Susie, 1912. Cubism was revolutionary for a number of reasons. It was the first modern art movement in which artists experimented with near-total abstraction, and it went on to inspire other art movements, including suprematism, futurism, and constructivism.
Who was Robert Rauschenberg?
Robert Rauschenberg, 1925 to 2008, along with Jasper Johns, his close friend, occasional lover, and business partner, was one of the most influential artists in pop art. And he is credited with leading art away from abstract expressionism. He is particularly famous for erasing a de Kooning drawing and then framing the empty page in a work he called Erased de Kooning Drawing, 1953.
What is pop art?
Pop art began in the 1950s in Britain. The term itself was invented by English art critic Lawrence Alloway, and became one of the most influential art movements of the mid-20th century, particularly in Britain and the United States. Pop artists challenged the status of fine art by relying on mass media images, such as those from advertisements and popular culture, to create artworks. Key pop artists include Alan Jones, 1937, Eduardo Bolazzi, 1924 to 2005, Peter Blake, 1930, and Richard Hamilton, 1922 to 2011, all of whom worked primarily in the UK. American pop artists include Roy Lichtenstein, 1923-2007, Robert Rauschenberg, 1925 to 2008, Jasper Johns, 1930, and most notably, Andy Warhol, 1928 to 1987. Early pop art shows were held in London and New York City, including the This Is Tomorrow show at the Whitechapel Art Gallery and a number of shows at New York's Sydney Janis Gallery. Critics were mixed in their reviews, with many critics shocked at the use of low art to create works of fine art. For example, Robert Rauschenberg, who studied painting under Bauhaus artist Joseph Albers, created a series of works incorporating the Coca-Cola logo and Roy Lichtenstein's large paintings mimicked the look and style of comic book art. Pop art questioned the difference between good and bad taste, and broadened the scope of possible fine art subject matter to include everyday objects and culture.
Who is David Hockney?
David Hockney, 1937, is considered an important early pop artist, though he dislikes that association and his work demonstrates a range of styles. A prominent contemporary artist whose career kick-started while he was still a student at the Royal College of Art in London. Hockney's early work frequently incorporated poetic fragments and personal themes. Paintings such as We Two Boys Together Clinging, 1961, are reminiscent of the art brut of Jean Dubuffet with scrawled handwriting and childlike forms. Hockney's mid-career paintings are notably smooth and painted with acrylic, reflecting the artist's skill as a graphic artist as well as a painter. His most famous pop artwork is arguably, The Big Splash, 1967. A brightly painted scene of a California swimming pool in which a jarring and geometric diving board juts into the center of the scene. A swirled splash breaks the smooth monotony of the pool's blue water, creating a photo-like image. In the 1970s and 80s, he experimented with collage by incorporating Polaroid fragments into highly ordered paintings. His work with photography led to a prestigious award from the Royal Photographic Society in 2003. Hockney continues to paint and receive recognition for his work, including monumental landscapes such as a bigger Grand Canyon. 1998, which is composed of over 60 individual paintings.
What is vorticism?
Vorticism was a brief but powerful artistic and literary movement that developed in England before World War I. In 1914, the editor of a magazine called Blast, Wyndham Lewis, founded vorticism, but its name was coined by the American expatriate poet, Ezra Pound. Lewis explained the movement when he wrote, "At the heart of a whirlpool is a great silent place where all the energy is concentrated. And there, at the point of concentration, is the vorticist," quoted in Dempsey 111. The goal was to create a uniquely British response to Cubism, Futurism, and Expressionism, and make energetic art that reflected the jarring realities of modern life in the early 20th century. Visual art representative of vorticism includes Lewis' composition, 1913. A dynamic rectilinear abstraction, and a vortographic photo image of Ezra Pound by Alvin Langdon Coburn in 1917. The vortiscope was a process invented by Coburn, who attached a series of mirrors to a camera lens to create pictures with multiple layers.
Who were some of the abstract expressionists?
Willem de Kooning, 1904 to 1997. De Kooning was a Dutch immigrant to America, who greatly inspired the American artists he encountered in New York City. Considered part of the New York School of Abstract Expressionists, his work is characterized by aggressive brush strokes and partial abstraction. One of his most famous works is Woman I, 1950 to 1952, which he repeated a number of times. The painting depicts a large-eyed, aggressive woman with a wide, toothy smile and a wild, abstract form. The energy of de Kooning's work aligned the artist with action painters, and his work made a major impact on 20th-century American modernism. Arshile Gorky, 1905 to 1948. Gorky was an Armenian-American painter whose early Cubist Surrealist style influenced the abstract expressionists. His painting Garden in Sochi, c. 1943, Shares similarities with the biomorphic abstraction of Henry Moore. Hans Hofmann, 1880 to 1966, born in Germany. Hofmann was an art teacher who introduced a new American generation to European modernism. His work, as exemplified in The Gate, 1959 to 1960, is bold and colorful, and emphasizes visual structure and color relationships. Franz Klein, 1910 to 1962. Klein's work was large and he is particularly well known for his white canvases slashed with aggressive, black brush strokes. These works evoke Chinese calligraphy and draw attention to the dynamic power and structural qualities of the brush stroke. Robert Motherwell, 1915 to 1991. Motherwell was a member of the New York School and was inspired by Surrealist automatism and European modernism. He was a writer and a teacher, and had an intellectual approach to abstraction. He painted the series, Elegies to the Spanish Republic, throughout his long career. These works served as philosophical mediations on the nature of loss, death, and visual form. Lee Krasner, 1911 to 1984. Lee Krasner was an important abstract expressionist painter and the wife of Jackson Pollock. She was highly critical of her own work, even occasionally destroying finished pieces. She produced large, gestural paintings such as The Seasons, 1957. Barnett Newman, 1905 to 1970. Newman was an important color field painter whose work often features a zip or long, thin, vertical line of color painted against a boldly colored background. Newman's zip has been likened to an obelisk. Newman searched for the sublime through overwhelming fields of pure color. Jackson Pollock, 1912 to 1956. Pollock is one of the most enduringly popular abstract expressionists. Known for his aggressive painting style and technique of splattering paint directly onto the canvas. He laid his paintings flat on the ground, and walked over them with back bent, applying paint directly. While it seems like his paintings would be chaotic, their overall effect is often rhythmic and contemplative. Ad Reinhardt, 1913 to 1967. Reinhardt was known for making art as art, and emphasizing the separation between art and life. He distilled his paintings to a single color and his later paintings are completely black, with no trace of a brush stroke. This was done in an attempt to completely separate the work from the act of its creation. Mark Rothko, 1903 to 1970. Rothko was interested in emotional and spiritual communication in his large color field paintings. The monumental canvases of Mark Rothko feature soft edge areas of rich color where different hues never quite touch one another, creating a tension Rothko linked to tension within human relations. Rothko's paintings are infused with spirituality and psychological ambiguity. Clyfford Still, 1904 to 1980. Still was also a color field painter. Though his works are more aggressive than Rothko's due to jagged areas of color, varied textures, and juxtaposed hues. His massive paintings have been equated with landscapes. Helen Frankenthaler, 1928 to 2011, though she used oil and acrylic paint. Frankenthaler's large paintings have the look of watercolor, with stained canvas and large areas of fluid color. Staining produces an almost textureless open space within the canvas that garnered her the support of modernist critic, Clement Greenberg.
What is the difference between the bridge and the Blue Riders?
The Bridge and the Blue Riders were both groups of German expressionist artists who shared artistic values, promoted the symbolic power of color, and believed that art could communicate powerful positive or spiritual messages to the viewer. The Bridge, known as German as Die Brücke, was founded in Dresden in 1905 by 4 architecture students. Fritz Bleyl, 1880 to 1966, Erich Heckel, 1883 to 1970. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, 1880 to 1938, and Karl Schmidt-Rottluff, 1884 to 1976. Their name came from the philosophical writing of Friedrich Nietzsche, and they shared the philosopher's idea that the present day can positively influence the future, acting as a bridge to the future. The artistic style of the Bridge artists was inspired by so-called primitive non-Western art, such as African masks, which they believed was somehow more authentic than Western art. They were also inspired by nature and Russian literature. Key works produced by members of the Bridge include Schmidt-Rottluff's 3 nudes Dune picture from Nidden, 1913, and Kirchner's Street, Berlin, 1913, which depicts 2 prostitutes, one wearing a purple coat, against a bright pink urban background. Der Blaue Reiter, the Blue Riders, was another expressionist group founded in Germany, in Munich rather than Dresden. Members included the Russian painter Vasily Kandinsky, 1866 to 1944, and German artist Franz Marc, 1880 to 1916, who was killed during World War I. Marc was interested in the symbolism of the color blue, and he believed that blue was the most spiritual color. One of Marc's most recognizable paintings is The Large Blue Horses, 1911, which depicts the backs and bowed necks of a group of deeply blue horses as if they are distant mountains against a burnt, orange sky. Kandinsky was inspired by Russian folk art and was deeply interested in art history and philosophy. Kandinsky associated realism with the negative aspects of materialism, and as his career developed, his art became less and less figurative. He explained that he wanted his art to inspire spiritual awareness in his viewers. Kandinsky was also inspired by the 19th-century artist Whistler to give his paintings musical titles such as Composition for 1911, Improvisation 28, 1912, and even Contrasting Sounds, 1924. His work is also thought to be inspired by his synesthesia, a neurological condition in which one can see numbers, letters, or even sound as color. Kandinsky's theories and paintings on the spiritual quality of visual art were extremely influential for modern art. Expressionist paintings from both the Bridge and the Blue Riders made a major impact on 20th century art due to their philosophical goals and interest in expressive abstraction.
Who was Amelia Pelles?
Amelia Pelles, 1896 to 1968. Was an important Cuban artist whose modernist paintings visually explore Cuban identity. Pelles studied art in both Cuba and Paris, where she was inspired by Cubism and Constructivism. Especially the work of Russian artist Alexandra Ixter. Her paintings are flat and boldly colored, with black outlines, and are reminiscent of the tropical climate of Cuba. During her later career, Pelles worked on ceramics and murals. Examples of her work include Mar Pacifico, Hibiscus, 1943, Nina con Paloma. Girl with a Dove, 1947, and numerous untitled works and sculptures.
Why did Roy Lichtenstein paint comic book images?
Roy Lichtenstein, 1923 to 1997, whose early work reflected interest in Cubism and abstract expressionism, began to make his comic book paintings in the 1960s. With paintings such as Wham! 1963, and Eddie Diptych, 1962. Lichtenstein transformed comic images into monumental works of fine art by enlarging them and rendering them with the so-called Ben-Day dots used to print newspaper images. His approach has been described by some critics as a parody, but one in line with the goals of pop art. While Lichtenstein was able to transform the low art of comic books into fine art paintings, he also did the opposite. His yellow brush stroke, 1965, depicts a single smear of yellow paint. With so much detail it becomes nearly laughable, and completely banal. He also converted famous masterpieces, such as Vincent van Gogh's bedroom in Arles, 1888, into his iconic comic style. One of Lichtenstein's goals in creating these comic-like images was to encourage the viewer to question the way supposedly realistic paintings accurately depict reality.
What is futurism?
Futurism was an energetic Italian art movement started by the poet Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, 1876 to 1944, who wrote the first futurist manifesto in Le Figaro, a French newspaper. In 1909, Marinetti wanted futurism to be a wide-reaching movement that embraced the speed and power of modern industrialism. The goal was to reject the past and to modernize contemporary culture violently if necessary. Visually, futurism would not have existed without Cubism. and many futurist paintings feature fragmented forms and geometric near-abstraction. However, the futurists tried to distance themselves from this inheritance. Painters associated with futurism include Umberto Boccioni, 1880–1916. Gino Severini, 1883–1966, and Carlo Carra, 1881–1916. The futurists created abstract images of machines and placed an emphasis on movement. Giacomo Balla's dynamism of a dog on a leash, leash in motion. 1912, depicts a small dog with blurry legs and a blurry tail made up of quickly dashed, repeated brush strokes. Umberto Boccioni incorporated sculpture into the futurist repertoire, with works such as Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, 1913. This flowing, abstract sculpture was cast in bronze and creates an interplay between two- and three-dimensional space as a formidable figure with outstretched legs, and no arms, strides forward on a horizontal plane. Futurism changed after World War I. Boccioni was killed after being thrown from his horse during a military exercise, and the landscape of Europe, both physically and artistically, was no longer the same.
What is avant-garde art?
As with many art terms, the word avant-garde comes from French and roughly translates to vanguard. Avant-garde art is art that is on the front lines, and the term can be used to describe any innovative or new modern art. The experimentations of avant-garde artists, writers, and thinkers often cause shock, and even anger, among critics and general audiences. The mid-19th century paintings of Edouard Manet, especially Olympia and Déjeuner sur l'herbe, shocked audiences for their confrontational nudity and manipulation of traditional subject matter. Throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries, waves of avant-garde movements have continued to ruffle feathers and push boundaries. From Monet's Impressionist experimentations, to Cubism, to Duchamp's Fountain, 1917.
What is Orpheism?
Orphism, sometimes called Orphic Cubism, is a movement that developed within Cubism, and is characterized by abstractions and rhythmic color arranged to emphasize the joyous power of creation and the relationship between visual art and music. The name Orphism was coined by French poet Guillaume Apollinaire, 1880–1918, and the name refers to the mythological figure Orpheus, a poet whose beautiful lyrics and music could seduce wild animals. One of the major artists associated with Orphism was Robert Delaunay, 1885–1941. Who passed through a Cubist phase and experimented with color theory and concepts of space. Much like his fellow Cubists, Braque and Picasso, Delaunay created color abstractions such as simultaneous contrasts, sun and moon, 1913, that relied on color interactions to create a sense of depth and movement. Delaunay's wife Sonia also created Orphic works, including paintings, collages, and clothing designs. By 1914, Apollinaire and Delaunay could no longer agree on the main tenets of Orphism and the movement ended.
Who was Alberto Giacometti?
Alberto Giacometti, 1901 to 1966. Was a sculptor and painter born in the Italian-speaking portion of Switzerland. During his early career, he gained critical acclaim for his surrealist sculpture. And he was a formal member of the Surrealists until he left in the 1930s. Giacometti was inspired by the philosophy of existentialism and was friends with the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who even wrote a catalogue preface for one of Giacometti's Paris shows. His now iconic sculptures of bronze, skeletal human figures have been interpreted in relation to the state of society after the devastation of World War II. Interested in the experience of perception. Giacometti's lurching sculptures have also been described as shadows of the human form. In recent art auctions, his work has fetched tens of millions of dollars.
Who was Diego Rivera?
Diego Rivera, 1886 to 1957. Was an internationally renowned Mexican artist known for creating monumental public murals. Like Picasso, who he met while studying in Europe, Rivera was a child prodigy. During his early career, he went through a synthetic cubist phase. However, his mature style is characterized by large, figurative murals. Diego Rivera, along with other important Mexican artists such as José Clemente Orozco and David Alfaro Siqueiros, aimed to create a new national art for Mexico. He studied frescoes in Italy and applied the technique to his murals, such as his series of Mexican history paintings at the Palacio Nacional, National Palace, in Mexico City, which blends European with Mayan and Aztec styles and features rich, bold colors and simplified forms. Rivera also completed murals in the United States, including his depiction of Detroit industry, 1932 to 1933, at the Detroit Institute of Art. A vocal communist, Rivera's politics sometimes caused criticism in America. While working on a commission from the Rockefeller family in New York, for example, Rivera planned to add a portrait of Russian leader Vladimir Lenin. The Rockefellers refused, paid Rivera's fee, and destroyed his unfinished mural. Rivera ended up completing a different version of the mural, called Man, Controller of the Universe, 1934, at the Museo del Palacio de Bellas Artes, Museum of Fine Art, which is one of Rivera's most celebrated works.
How did African art influence art of the early 20th century?
At the beginning of the early 20th century, Western artists such as Pablo Picasso (1881 to 1973) and Émile Nolde (1867 to 1956) became interested in the so-called primitive art of non-Western cultures, including the arts of Africa and the Pacific. In France, artists were able to see non-Western art at the Musée d'Ethnographie in Paris. Although they were inspired by the visual expressivity and relative abstraction of much non-Western art, most European artists made little to no attempt to understand the historical and cultural context of the pieces they viewed, and often purchased. Picasso's art was significantly inspired by African style, allowing the artist freedom to explore with color and style. For example, one of his most important paintings, Des Moiselles d'Avignon, 1907, is characterized by elongated figures and abstract faces commonly found in African masks and sculpture. Another painting, Mother and Child, 1907, uses bold colors and ovoid forms to reinvent traditional Christian subject matter. Despite the clear influence, Picasso occasionally downplayed the importance of African art, his own work, preferring not to talk about it.
Why did Jasper Johns paint the American flag?
Jasper Johns, 1930, is an American contemporary artist known for his painting, printing, and sculpture. His paintings frequently feature familiar objects and symbols such as targets, numbers, and the American flag. In line with the themes and goals of pop art, Johns was interested in using familiar objects in a new way. Rather than create new images, he wanted to depict things the mind already knows. As quoted in the Met Museum Timeline of Art History, he said that his decision to paint flags was inspired by a dream, and his realistic works serve to highlight the artificiality of the symbols he represents.
Who was Sol Solar?
Sol Solar was the pseudonym of Argentinian avant-garde artist Oscar Agustin Alejandro Schultz Solari, 1887 to 1963. In Latin, the word for light is lux, the reverse of which became his name. Much of Sol Solar's work is either unknown or unseen by the public as he worked on small watercolor paintings that were rarely exhibited during his lifetime. His work is indebted to European modernism, and Solar was particularly influenced by Paul Klee. But it is also infused with the artist's personal interest in mysticism and indigenous culture. Paintings such as Hafa, Patronus, 1923, are brightly colored and incorporate figurative imagery with abstract form and symbols, such as numbers and the Jewish Star of David. Sol Solar's work, which also included sculpture and writing, is an example of the ways in which Latin American artists took European modernism and made it their own.
Who was Pablo Picasso?
Pablo Picasso, 1881 to 1973, is perhaps one of the most famous modern artists of all time. Born in Spain, he produced thousands of works of art during his lifetime, and is known for his artistic genius and avant-garde innovations. Picasso was a painter and a sculptor and experimented with collage, mixed media, and sculptural assemblages. He is credited with developing Cubism, along with fellow Cubist and fierce competitor Georges Braque. He helped to popularize non-Western art, and he experimented with symbolism, expressionism, classicism, surrealism, and more. Like many of the great artists described by Giorgio Vasari in the Lives of the Artists, Picasso's talent was discovered at a young age by his father, also an artist. He began formal artistic training as a young boy and was admitted to the School of Fine Arts in Barcelona at 14 years old. During his studies at this school and others, he copied the work of the great masters, and then later began to socialize with avant-garde circles of artists and thinkers. Picasso's work features a range of styles, media, and forms, and is therefore categorized into periods, including the early Blue period. During Picasso's Blue period, he painted The Guitar Player, 1910. A melancholy portrait of a social outcast playing the guitar with long, bony fingers. After the Blue period was Picasso's so-called Rose period, during which his work became brighter, more delicate, and more varied in color. Work from Picasso's Rose period includes The Family of Saltimbanques, 1905. A painting that depicts a group of traveling acrobats appearing lost in a desolate landscape. One of Picasso's most important paintings is Guernica, 1937. A monumental work inspired by atrocities committed by Spain's far-right political party, the Falange, which was responsible for bombing the Basque city of Guernica, killing nearly 2,000 people. The painting's dimensions reach nearly 12 x 25 feet. It is a mass of complex imagery and swooping, disjointed human and animal figures in monochrome. Guernica was exhibited at the Exposition Universelle, World's Fair, in Paris in 1937, and has since become so famous that its political impact has been upstaged by its importance as a visual masterpiece.
What is magic realism?
First coined in 1925 by the German art critic Franz Roh. Magic realism flourished from the 1920s to the 1950s. Magic realism can be described as a realistic approach 228 to fantastical subject matter. Artists most associated with the style include American artists Yvonne Albright, 1897 to 1983, and Peter Bloom, 1906 to 1992, as well as French artists Paul Delvaux, 1897 to 1994, and René Magritte, 1898 to 1967. who was probably the most famous magic realist painter, but is usually categorized as a surrealist. The works of these artists are characterized by a sense of mystery juxtaposed with the normalcy of everyday objects.
What are Bisjay poles?
The Bisjay pole is an important ritual wood carving made by the Asmat people of the western portion of New Guinea. The Bisjay pole is a tall, narrow ancestor pole depicting ancestor spirits standing upon one another, and can be approximately 20 feet high. The Bisjay pole plays an important role in the Asmat tradition of head hunting, and is used in ceremonies related to the cycle of life, death, and warfare. The Asmat make the Bisjay pole from sago palm because, according to legends, Asmat ancestors were first created from sago palms by a divine hero named Fumaripitsjay, the first being on earth. This fact emphasizes the Asmat correlation between the human body and the tree. By extension, the human head is symbolically represented as fruit. On the pole itself, carved images of birds eating fruit represent the head hunter who eats the brain of a warrior he has captured. Large, protruding fins at the top of the Bisjay pole are phallic symbols of power and virility.
Who was Andy Warhol?
Andy Warhol, 1928 to 1987, was an iconic artist celebrity whose pop art images of camels, soup cans and film celebrities continue to be highly recognizable and immensely valuable. Popularly known for his bleach blonde hair, dark sunglasses, and turtleneck sweaters, Andy Warhol was interested in stripping mass media images of their symbolic value, thus rendering them anew. Born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Warhol studied at the Carnegie Institute and moved to New York City in 1949, where he began a career in commercial art. He also worked in painting, printmaking, sculpture, and film. Warhol's New York studio, dubbed The Factory, was where Warhol and his team of assistants used silk screen machines to mass-produce images. His goal was to mechanically produce familiar images until they no longer held any meaning. Like saying the same word over and over until it sounds like nonsense. This explains paintings such as Fragile Handle with Care, which depicts the word fragile repeatedly, until the words become nearly abstract. Similarly, Warhol made an 8-hour-long film of the Empire State Building, created using a single, drawn-out shot. Warhol's work dominated the 1960s art and fashion scene, and he continued to push boundaries into the 1980s, with celebrity portraits and continued exploitation of celebrity.
Who was Francis Bacon?
Francis Bacon, 1909 to 1992, was a British painter whose expressive, figurative works often depict scenes of psychological horror. Bacon is often categorized as an existentialist artist. His paintings of Pope Innocent X were modeled after a portrait done by Velázquez in the 16th century. However, Bacon's Pope sits within the confines of a cage-like throne. His face smeared with aggressive streaks of paint against a menacingly black background. Bacon's paintings depict intense scenes of anguish. The artist himself said, "I hope to make the best human cry in painting. To remake the violence of reality itself," as quoted in Stockstad 1128.
Why was Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon so important?
Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon, 1907, was significant because it shocked the early 20th century art world and foreshadowed Cubism and other forms of 20th century modernism. The large painting, 7.9 x 7.6 feet, depicts a group of nude prostitutes with large, almond-shaped eyes, disjointed poses, and mask-like faces. The painting was radical for its subject matter as well as its incorporation of African style, especially on such a large scale. The painting was not necessarily a critical success, and even Picasso's friends found it to be ugly. However, the artist Georges Braque, 1882–1963, saw the painting and was inspired by its broken lines and geometric dissolution of form. Demoiselles d'Avignon inspired Braque to experiment with a style that would be known as Cubism. One of the most significant revolutions in modern art.
Why are the Cubist paintings of Braque and Picasso so similar?
Even for scholars, it is sometimes nearly impossible to tell the work of Picasso and Braque apart. And it is possible that Cubism would not have developed at all without the competitive exchange of ideas that occurred during the dueling careers of these two artists. Both explored still lives, were intrigued by the physical properties of musical instruments, and often painted with similar color palettes. As Braque himself explained, "We were like two mountain climbers roped together," quoted in Stockstad 1079.
What is the Carney cloak?
The Carney cloak is a Hawaiian feathered cape that was given as a gift to King George III of England by Hawaiian King Kamehameha around 1843. The red and yellow cape was made of coconut fiber to which feathers were attached. Worn like a cloak, the garment is known as a ahu'ula, red cloak, due to its color. In Hawaii, red is symbolic of royalty, and feathers were used to decorate luxury. High-status items such as clothing, blankets, and leis, traditional Hawaiian garlands, The status of the Karni cloak is tied to the status of the Hawaiian king, and is therefore an appropriate and significant gift for another ruler.
What is existentialist art?
After World War II, European artists, writers, and thinkers struggled to come to terms with not only the physical destruction wrought by war, but with its psychological toll. Existentialism was a philosophical response popularized by French thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre. 1905 to 1980, whose treatise Being and Nothingness. 1943, described the anxiety and meaninglessness of existence, as well as the pursuit of authenticity in life. Existentialism was a powerful influence on post-war art in Europe, and its themes were explored by artists such as Francis Bacon, Alberto Giacometti, and Jean Dubuffet.
What is Aboriginal art?
Aboriginal art is the art of the indigenous people of Australia, whose artistic traditions continue to thrive to this day. Aboriginal art includes rock art, body art, bark paintings, fiber arts, and portable sculptures. Aboriginal people are traditionally nomadic. Aboriginal peoples have lived in Australia for the last 40,000 years, and their art is closely connected to their religious beliefs and complex mythology. The Aboriginal spiritual world is called Jakarpa, which is usually translated into English as the dreaming or the dream time, and emphasizes the connection between spiritual powers and place. It is important to note that Aboriginal artists are not creating anything new or original, but are reinterpreting designs and artistic elements that have been passed down by spirit ancestors. Many contemporary Aboriginal artists now use acrylic paint to create traditional dot paintings or bark paintings. The work of 20th-century Aboriginal artist Clifford Possum Tejapaltjari, 1932 to 2002, helped bring Aboriginal art to the attention of the international art world, and it is now part of major museum and gallery collections around the globe.
Who was Frida Kahlo?
Frida Kahlo, 1907 to 1954, may have been married to Diego Rivera, but her style of painting was highly individual and eschewed the monumentality of many of her male counterparts who were part of the Mexican muralist movement. Kahlo's autobiographical self-portraits had more in common with miniature paintings, and she was highly influenced by Mexican folk painting, although not officially considered a surrealist. Many of her paintings focus on themes of emotion and psychology through slightly disturbing, dreamlike imagery. Her painting, The Two Fridas, 1939, depicts two seated self-portraits. one dressed in a European-style dress and the other in traditional Mexico clothing. Representing her dual heritage, her father was German and her mother was Mexican. The anatomically detailed hearts of both Fridas can be seen through their chests, each connected with a long, thin blood vessel that wraps around them. The Frida on the left holds a pair of scissors and she cuts the vessel, blood spilling from the tip. This is thought to represent both Aztec sacrifice and the lifelong pain she suffered after a traumatic bus accident in 1925. Other famous works by Kahlo include Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace, 1940, and Self-Portrait on the Border between Mexico and the United States, 1932.
What is the difference between action painting and color field painting?
Action painting is a type of abstract expressionism with close ties to surrealist automatism. It is sometimes also called gestural painting or gestural abstraction. Action painting is improvisational and emphasizes uncontrolled creativity and the process of painting itself. The three main artists associated with action painting are Willem de Kooning, Frans Klein, and Jackson Pollock, whose works emphasize the physical nature of their creation through large, often frenetic brush strokes, visible paint drips, and aggressive style. For example, Jackson Pollock painted Eyes in Heat, 1946. By squeezing liquid paint directly onto the canvas from the tube and then smearing it. The result is a highly textured canvas filled with swirling painted forms. Color field painting is somewhat less aggressive than action painting, though no less emotionally impactful. Color field painting is characterized by large, abstract areas of solid color. As seen in the work of Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, Robert Motherwell, Clifford Still, and Helen Frankenthaler. Helen Frankenthaler even stained her canvases with color. Both action painters and color field painters believed that their works were in no way devoid of subject matter, but that color and action were essential to creative expression.
What is the significance of tattoos for Pacific cultures?
Tattooing was, and continues to be, an important part of cultural and religious tradition throughout the Pacific, especially in Polynesia and New Zealand. The English word for tattoo even comes from the Polynesian word tata. Body art, including clothing and jewelry, as well as tattoos, indicates status, with specific patterns associated with particular ranks within a society. Tattoo designs were usually geometric. The Maori of New Zealand, whose word for tattoo is moko, have separate tattoo styles for men and women. And tattoos of different meanings were placed on different parts of the body. For example, tattoos on the right side of the face represented social status and lineage handed down from the father's side of the family, while tattoos on the left side on the face communicated maternal lineage. Bodies of the most prominent members of society could be completely covered in tattoos. After a period of decline, tattoos are once again being used to communicate status and cultural identity among the Maori of New Zealand.
What is a ngatu?
A ngatu is a royal Tongan bark cloth made by women. The Kingdom of Tonga is a group of over 100 islands located southeast of Fiji and southwest of Samoa. Fiji and Samoa also have bark cloth design traditions. Textiles such as the ngatu are highly prized items and are given as gifts during ceremonies and special occasions. Ngatu are hand-painted, rubbed with dye, stenciled, and perfumed. Usually deep brown, black, and beige in color, they can feature highly abstract designs or depict naturalistic images such as fish, or other sea life.
What is the significance of the meeting house in Pacific cultures?
Meeting or ceremonial houses are a significant part of Pacific architecture, and many Pacific cultures use these larger halls or houses for religious or rite of passage ceremonies. For example, the Abalam people of the East Sepik province in New Guinea display art and ritual objects in ceremonial houses in order to attract spirits during rituals. Abalam ceremonial houses are traditionally decorated with art objects made in a variety of materials, including fruit, leaves, stones, and shells. On the island of New Ireland, ceremonial houses are essential for Malagan. Ceremonies and wood sculptures are carved and displayed at the front of the house. In the mid-19th century, master carver Rahara Hirukipo supervised the construction of Te Haukituranga, a Maori meeting house in Gisborne, New Zealand. The house, a type known as a warinui, is covered in detailed high-relief wood carvings that have been rubbed with shark liver oil and red clay to produce rich color and luminescence. Along the 234 A-frame ceiling, is a repeating pattern of painted wood rafters and lattice panels, which were made by women artisans. Though the nature of the carvings is traditional, they were done with European-style metal tools during a time in the colonial 19th century. As Maori architecture was changing under the influence of Christianity, meeting houses across the Pacific serve as important locations for community meetings, rituals, and other ceremonial uses. Their construction is inextricably related to the creation of art objects, and to both the political and spiritual function they serve within a culture.
What is abstract expressionism?
Abstract expressionism, which lasted from the 1940s to the 1960s, was an American movement influenced by European modernism, surrealism, and non-Western art traditions. Surrealist principles of psychic automatism were particularly influential, as was the influence of psychology and mythology. Abstract expressionist paintings tend to be very large and intense, and feature dynamic, bold colors. For many abstract expressionist artists, the creative process itself was as important as the work. Abstraction expressionist paintings do not represent a specific visible subject, but they do communicate emotions and other less tangible subjects. Artists labeled as abstract expressionists were diverse in their approach and styles. The movement can be divided into multiple categories and sub-styles. The most prominent being action painting and color field painting.
What is constructivism?
Constructivism made a major impact on other 20th century movements such as Bauhaus and Istoria. Like Supermatism, constructivism was highly influenced by both Cubism and Futurism, and emphasized abstraction and the purity of geometric forms. The movement was founded by Russian painter and architect Vladimir Tatlin, 1885 to 1953, who created sculptural constructions. Interestingly, Tatlin did not consider himself a constructivist but rather a productivist. Though his work is considered to be at the heart of the movement. Tatlin made his sculptural assemblages out of industrial materials such as wood, plaster, glass, and metal. He also believed that art served an important social purpose, and the constructivist movement is tied to the radical political changes that occurred in Russia during the October Revolution in 1917. Constructivist artists believed that art could play an important role in the creation of a new, utopian society. One of the key elements of constructivism is the idea that a work of art, whether a painting or a sculpture, is created by assembling so-called autonomous elements. For example, a sculpture is made up of individual elements such as a line and a plane. This new concept conceived of sculpture as an additive, rather than reductive process. Materials are compiled, rather than carved away. And this had a major impact on painting, architecture, and design in the 20th century.
What is suprematism?
Suprematism developed between 1913 and 1915 by Russian artist Casimir Malevich 204, 1878 to 1935, was concerned with pure aesthetics and therefore promoted total abstraction and freedom from realism, politics, and the past. Suprematist paintings often depict geometric abstractions. Malevich was interested in the square as a pure form, and much of his work focuses on rectangular composition, such as Black Square, 1915, and Suprematist composition, White on White, 1918. Other paintings, such as suprematist composition conveying the feeling of a mystic wave from outer space. 1917, were visual attempts to communicate with the subconscious. Other artists associated with suprematism were Ivan Puni, 1894–1956, and Lyubo Popova, 1889–1924, among others.
What is OP art?
The op in op art refers to optical illusion and op art paintings, such as Bridget Riley's Metamorphosis, 1964, are composed of precise, geometric abstractions. Op art paintings pulse with an energy created by a strategic alignment of color and form, creating a blurring after-image. Similar to the experience of looking at a bright light for too long, or looking into a funhouse mirror. Hungarian artist Viktor Vasarely, 1908–1997, was a pioneer of op art. His commercial paintings of zebras, and their repetitious black and white stripes, served as early optic experimentations, while works such as the black and white supernovae, 1959–1961, are dynamic and restless. Vasarely linked these works to free-moving kinetic art by artists such as Alexander Calder. The viewer is an essential part of the op art experience because without the viewer, specifically the viewer's perception, there can be no optical illusion. Op art serves as an inquiry into the very nature of optical perception, the experience of seeing things.
What is OP art?
The op in op art refers to optical illusion and op art paintings, such as Bridget Riley's Metamorphosis, 1964, are composed of precise, geometric abstractions. Op art paintings pulse with an energy created by a strategic alignment of color and form, creating a blurring after-image. Similar to the experience of looking at a bright light for too long, or looking into a funhouse mirror. Hungarian artist Viktor Vasarely, 1908–1997, was a pioneer of op art. His commercial paintings of zebras, and their repetitious black and white stripes, served as early optic experimentations, while works such as the black and white supernovae, 1959–1961, are dynamic and restless. Vasarely linked these works to free-moving kinetic art by artists such as Alexander Calder. The viewer is an essential part of the op art experience because without the viewer, specifically the viewer's perception, there can be no optical illusion. Op art serves as an inquiry into the very nature of optical perception, the experience of seeing things.
Who was Eva Hesse?
Eva Hesse, 1936–1970. Was a German-American painter and sculptor whose Jewish family dramatically escaped Nazi Germany. Her highly experimental art is usually categorized as minimalist, however. Unlike many minimalists, narrative and personal history are an important part of her work. Her installation sculpture Rope Piece, 1969 to 1970, a tangled, slightly frightening web of rope, string, and wire, has a different form each time it is moved to a new location. The piece has been described as a drawing in space. Her work Accession 2, 1968 to 1969, now at the Detroit Institute of Art, is a cube made of vinyl and steel. The cube is open at the top, revealing a lush layer of fiber-like tubes, a reaction against the severity of much minimalist art.
Who was Eva Hesse?
Eva Hesse, 1936 to 1970. Was a German-American painter and sculptor whose Jewish family dramatically escaped Nazi Germany. Her highly experimental art is usually categorized as minimalist, however. Unlike many minimalists, narrative and personal history are an important part of her work. Her installation sculpture Rope Piece, 1969 to 1970, a tangled, slightly frightening web of rope, string, and wire, has a different form each time it is moved to a new location. The piece has been described as a drawing in space. Her work Accession 2, 1968 to 1969, now at the Detroit Institute of Art, is a cube made of vinyl and steel. The cube is open at the top, revealing a lush layer of fiber-like tubes, a reaction against the severity of much minimalist art.
What is post-painterly abstraction?
The term post-painterly abstraction was coined by influential American art critic Clement Greenberg, 1909 to 1994, to describe abstract art inspired by but separate from American abstract expressionism. His term encapsulated multiple categories 242 of abstraction, including, but not limited to, hard edge painting and stain painting. Hard edge painting, as exemplified by the work of artists Frank Stella, 1936, and Ellsworth Kelly, 1923, is characterized by large geometric areas of color with absolutely no blending. Colors transition abruptly from one to the next, such as in Stella's Grand Cairo. 1962, a painting composed of a colorful series of ever smaller square outlines. The artist Helen Frankenthaler is known for championing the technique of staining the canvas with pure color. Also considered to be a form of post-painterly abstraction. Post-painterly abstraction emphasizes the formal qualities of painting, such as shape and color. Artists experimented with shaped canvas, transforming the painting into an object, or sculpture. Post-painterly abstraction lasted until the 1970s, when postmodern artists began to challenge the supremacy of modernist critic Clement Greenberg.
What is post-painterly abstraction?
The term post-painterly abstraction was coined by influential American art critic Clement Greenberg. 1909 to 1994, to describe abstract art inspired by but separate from American abstract expressionism. His term encapsulated multiple categories 242 of abstraction, including, but not limited to, hard edge painting and stain painting. Hard edge painting, as exemplified by the work of artists Frank Stella, 1936, and Ellsworth Kelly, 1923, is characterized by large geometric areas of color with absolutely no blending. Colors transition abruptly from one to the next, such as in Stella's Gran Cairo. 1962, a painting composed of a colorful series of ever smaller square outlines. The artist Helen Frankenthaler is known for championing the technique of staining the canvas with pure color. Also considered to be a form of post-painterly abstraction. Post-painterly abstraction emphasizes the formal qualities of painting, such as shape and color. Artists experimented with shaped canvas, transforming the painting into an object, or sculpture. Post-painterly abstraction lasted until the 1970s, when postmodern artists began to challenge the supremacy of modernist critic Clement Greenberg.
What is minimalism?
Minimalism is a term that describes simple, geometric art that is often impersonal and made with a new set of materials, including aluminum, plexiglass, plywood, and steel. Minimalist artists attempted to distill their work into a pure form, editing any reference to personality, feelings, symbolism, or story. The style became popular during the mid-1960s, though many art critics at the time accused minimalism of being too cold, and questioned whether art could, or should, be produced by industrial means. The term minimalism has been used to describe the art of many artists. From Ad Reinhardt to Yves Klein, Frank Stella to Robert Rauschenberg. The work of artist Donald Judd, 1928 to 1994, is a good example of minimalism. Judd explored the difference between painting and sculpture with his series of wall structures. Judd's wall structures are composed of a series of machinematic rectangular forms that protrude from the wall. Forms that he called specific objects. The work of artist Anne Truitt, 1921 to 2004, occasionally blurred the line between minimalism and color field painting. However, her minimalist sculpture Grant, 1963, a long wooden beam, painted in acrylic, was a pure, impersonal, geometric form.
What is minimalism?
Minimalism is a term that describes simple, geometric art that is often impersonal and made with a new set of materials, including aluminum, plexiglass, plywood, and steel. Minimalist artists attempted to distill their work into a pure form, editing any reference to personality, feelings, symbolism, or story. The style became popular during the mid-1960s, though many art critics at the time accused minimalism of being too cold, and questioned whether art could, or should, be produced by industrial means. The term minimalism has been used to describe the art of many artists. From Ad Reinhardt to Yves Klein, Frank Stella to Robert Rauschenberg. The work of artist Donald Judd, 1928 to 1994, is a good example of minimalism. Judd explored the difference between painting and sculpture with his series of wall structures. Judd's wall structures are composed of a series of machinematic rectangular forms that protrude from the wall. Forms that he called specific objects. The work of artist Anne Truitt, 1921 to 2004, occasionally blurred the line between minimalism and color field painting. However, her minimalist sculpture Grant 1963, a long wooden beam, painted in acrylic was a pure, impersonal, geometric form.